Chapter 3, Questions and No Answers. When they arrived home and Izuku went straight to his room, Eli decided to ask Inko a few questions about this Kukin kid that had gotten in the way and verbally and physically assaulted Izuku. First off, she asked whether Inko recognized the name Kukin. Inko blinked. Yes, I know who that is, that's Izuku's best friend, Katsuki Bakugou. Those two have been friends basically since Izuku was born. He hasn't been around here in a while though, not for years now that I think about it. She furrowed her brow, thinking back to how long it had actually been since Katsuki had been around to visit. He prevented Izuku from returning home and unleashed some form of explosive on him, Eli told her. He then yelled at Izuku, swearing profusely, and denying he had a quirk at all, before storming off in anger. What? Inko exclaimed. Katsuki's quirk is explosion, but why would he use that on Izuku? They're friends? They've been friends for forever. Izuku did act that way, but I saw exactly no other child in the school treat him well, Eli said. At best they ignored him, like he wasn't there, but there were an unexpected number that mocked him when he was nearby. Aside from one boy that threw a paper ball at him, Katsuki was the only one to get physical with him. Inko took a while to get over her shock. That can't be right. Mitsuki has a foul mouth, but she wouldn't let Katsuki bully anyone. He wants to be a hero, he should know things like that are wrong. His mother might not know any more than you do, Eli suggested. The boy did not act like I would expect a hero to act either, using the definitions that Izuku has given me at least. She conceded, as the term hero could be a lot looser for those she'd known before. I think I need to talk to Mitsuki about this, Inko said. Eli just nodded before wandering off to join Izuku in his room. She found the boy with his nose in a notebook. Looking over his shoulder she saw a surprisingly decent sketch of herself with a list of her physical capabilities, comments of his own sprinkled amongst it all. She tapped him on the shoulder, making him jump. You should do one of those for yourself, she told him. I'm metal, there's nothing I can really do to get stronger or faster. You're alive, and you're rather scrawny. Like I said before, you're the weak point in our partnership. If you die, I disappear. Izuku slumped in on himself. I know that, he said, his voice almost too low to hear. What can I do though? I mean, without you, I'm basically quirkless. What can a quirkless person actually do? Eli huffed. Are you upset by what that blonde brat said earlier? She asked. Ignore him, and if he decides to attack you again, I'll show you just how far I can launch him. I'm sure I can reach the sea from here, it's not too far away. You can't do that, Izuku gasped. Kukin's really strong, but water dilutes his sweat. He can't use his quirk like that. If you threw him too far he might die before he could get back to shore. So if you dumped enough water over him, he'd basically be quirkless then, Eli asked, a small smirk on her face. Sounds like a big weakness. What's he going to do when it rains if he makes it as a hero? Not do his job? Izuku shook his head. No, Kukin's really smart. He'd probably have a hero costume with, like, water balloons or something that could he store his quirk in, and use that instead. So grenades then, Eli said. And how many heroes have some sort of power that can be reproduced with technology? Wasn't there a hero you talked about that could toss fire about? How's that different from a flamethrower? I think Endeavor's a bit better than a flamethrower, Izuku mumbled, but he still understood her point. With the right equipment and skills, it might be possible for a quirkless person to match up to someone with a quirk. It would be a lot harder, and they'd be limited by what they could carry or wear, but it might be possible. That small hope planted a seed in Izuku's mind, and bolstered by Eli's encouragement, he flipped over a page in his notebook and reached for his laptop. First thing first, find as many heroes with minor or less powerful quirks and see how they fought. He knew who he was going to start with as well. Mandali of the Wild Pussycats, quirk, telepath. XXXXX Mitsuki. Bakugou had a scowl on her face as she got off the phone with her longtime friend Inko Midoriya. What she'd been told had been a surprise, and not a pleasant one either. It seemed her son needed disciplining. She kicked the door to her son's room open and yelled at him from the doorway. Oi, brat, did something happen with Izuku today at school? She asked, about as polite as she ever was, at least in the privacy of her own home. Fuck off, hag, he's fucking fine. Katsuki yelled right back. Got some sort of robot toy now, but who the fuck cares about that? A robot summoned by his quirk, I heard, yeah. Mitsuki said. One that had a few things to say about you today. Want to explain that? He doesn't have a fucking quirk. It's just some sort of robot, fucking anyone can build. 1. Katsuki scowled. Idiot's not completely fucking stupid, he could do it if he really wanted to. That was probably as close to a compliment as he was going to give DEKU. He might not have a quirk, but he was smart. Now if only he realized he couldn't be a hero with how weak and powerless he was. The robot is his quirk. Mitsuki said. He summoned it when a villain had a gun to his head. Inko says the doctor thinks it was stress that caused his quirk to start working. Wait, it really is a fucking quirk? Katsuki asked. He had thought that DEKU had been lying about that. The idiot thought some fancy tattoo on the back of his hand had been his quirk 2 years ago. Fucking idiot had probably broken down in his head, made himself delusional. Yes, it's a quirk. Mitsuki confirmed. That's what Inko had said at least. Now what's this I hear about you trying to blow Izuku up with your quirk? TCH, I was just getting his attention. Katsuki said. He almost ran right past me. And you thought the best thing to do was explode him? Mitsuki asked. Fucking hell, Katsuki, learn some goddamn sense will you? I'm not stupid, hag. Fuck all else would make him actually look. Katsuki yelled back. The two bickered back and forth, the mother believing this was the end of things. She would be wrong. XXXXX back at the Midoriya residence, Izuku was quite surprised at how long his list had turned out, and there were some big names on there too. Mandali had been one of them, but so had her teammate Ragdoll. Then there was Sir Nightai, All Might's sidekick, and Power Loader, and even Nizu, a pro hero who was actually an animal with a quirk. His quirk gave him super intelligence according to his official hero page, that was it. He wasn't fast, strong, or anything like that. Finding footage of any fight with him in it was difficult, but it wasn't non-existent. Nizu worked more with cyber criminals and analytics than anything else, but almost every hero had been in a fight at least once, even idle heroes. Nizu almost didn't look like he was fighting in the videos he managed to pull up. He mocked and insulted the villains who bumbled into one trap after another, becoming infuriated with the small pro, before they exhausted themselves and Nizu was able to knock them out easily. Power Loader was another interesting one, as his hero page listed out several of his qualifications, including a number of engineering and design degrees. Unfortunately, Power Loader did a lot of his fighting below ground, using his fingers to rapidly dig through the earth like a mole, so that was less helpful to him. This proves my point, doesn't it? Eli said. Not all heroes have physical superiority over their foes, and even those stronger or tougher than normal can still face villains even stronger than themselves and win. Izuku nodded his head. While they'd been looking up hero videos, they'd seen a lot more than just what they'd been searching for. They'd seen villains with super strength and speed bested by heroes who didn't have the same level of power, proof that skill still played a part in such battles. Eli kept silent at that when Izuku had mentioned it. Skill did give you an advantage, but when the gap between two people was big enough, skill didn't make a difference. When she'd seen a video of All Might, the modern messiah, if the way everyone treated him meant anything, she doubted someone with even the speed and strength of a professional athlete would be able to stop him. Not unless he had some secret weakness, of course. Anyway, with Izuku's confidence now restored, the two began to discuss a workout plan for the boy. First on the list was a short jog after school every weekday. The local park should suffice for a location there, and on holidays they might replace that with a swim in the sea. Cycle routes were researched, and the two of them would attempt to follow one the coming Saturday, but Eli insisted he keep his Sundays free. She said that doing too much would break him rather than improve him. After a quick internet search, he reluctantly agreed. He wanted to get better now. He wanted to be a hero. What kid didn't? Every other kid had had their quirk for 4 years now. He needed to push himself super hard if he wanted to have even a chance of keeping up. Before they went any further, Inko called Izuku for supper, and the two shelved the discussion for now. XXXXX Inko was a worrier by nature, made even worse by her son's desire to be a hero, and further compounded by his lack of any sort of quirk. While he was proven to have a quirk now, she'd never stop worrying. Even if he had some sort of complete invulnerability quirk, she'd still worry for him, because she was his mother, and that's what she did. Now Izuku was asking if he could attend martial art classes, and had printed off pamphlets for the half a dozen near enough for him to get to. This was a big thing for her. If she did this, she'd be accepting just what it was that Izuku wanted to do. She knew her son wanted to be a hero, and she wanted to support Izuku in whatever he chose to do, but it was still nerve-wracking. She pulled a pad of paper towards herself and began to compare the different martial arts. Izuku had gotten a lot of his habits from her, and this was just one of them, to see which ones might be best. She almost struck Krav Maga off the list straight away. It had a rather well-known reputation for brutality after all, but she hesitated. Krav Maga was supposed to be very effective, and a quick search told her it was made to be rapidly teachable to military conscripts. While Izuku wasn't a violent person, and might have trouble with the aggressive parts of the martial art, he picked things up quickly, and she would love to see him get results back from training quickly. He was actually out right now, jogging, though she didn't think he'd get very far before having to slow down. He'd get better though. Izuku was stubborn like that, but his improvement might be hard to measure. Back to martial arts. Krav Maga, aside from its brutal philosophy, sounded about right, but she didn't want to put all her eggs in one basket. Taking a look at the next leaflet, she found it to wax on about all the great things about kickboxing. This one she actually discarded right away. While kickboxing may well be a wonderful martial art, this particular dojo apparently focused on it as a sport, and she wanted her son to learn martial arts for self-defense. Perhaps karate was a better choice? She reached for her laptop, a small smile on her face as she did so. She still worried for her son though. XXXXX Eli hadn't thought that Izuku would get far on his jog, and she wasn't all that impressed when he dropped, gasping for breath at her feet. Unimpressive, but not unexpected given he wasn't exactly the fittest child ever. She handed a water bottle to him, which he drank from, stopping himself from simply chugging it. He took deep breaths, slowing his breathing, getting himself back under control, before he got back to his feet and continued jogging. No, he wasn't the fittest boy ever, but he was bloody, determined and stubborn. Mecha Eli-chan had a small smile on her face as she kept count of the laps Izuku was doing around the park. It seemed that Izuku just needed someone to get him started, and he would go from there himself. XXXXX As Izuku went to sleep that night, Eli sat on the floor with her master's laptop on her knees. She'd have sat in a chair, but none of them were strong enough to support her weight. She began to research every servant that she was aware of. That was only a bare few dozen, less than 50 all told, and she hadn't even known them that well. However, on the chance that Izuku would summon another servant in the future, she thought he needed to know just how different they could be from how they had been portrayed historically. Potentially, she herself might be enough, being based on Elizabeth Bathory, but being a robot rather than the woman herself might complicate issues. Not that she wasn't pleased that they saw her as someone else entirely, which she was, just wary about who else could be summoned. The way Izuku had talked about heroes and villains had been strange to her. It seemed they'd overtaken everything in the modern world. There were idol heroes, but not so many idols any longer. There was music still, but a significant portion were entertainment heroes. The police and fire service were reduced, partially replaced with combat and investigation heroes for the former, rescue heroes for the latter. She supposed this might be a natural progression of things. It did make sense in a way. With quirks in the mix, traditional methods of crime prevention simply wouldn't work, or they wouldn't be as effective, resulting in enhanced law enforcement becoming a thing. Given how fast quirks had spread, governments would have had to change equally quickly, and things like that tend to scare the public. There's always some idiot claiming the world's gone the way of 1984, or similar stories, and having enhanced law enforcement has always been an element of stories in a dystopian future setting. This would mean that propaganda and positive advertising was needed. Hero is a word with a very positive spin on it, and adding in colorful costumes and friendly, or at least ones that seem that way, personalities would put people at ease. For all she knew, the ones in charge at the dawn of quirks had actually taken notes and ideas from comic books and manga. The way the world functioned now basically meant they were living in just such a world. She frowned at that. In the entire history of quirks, there'd been ones that could do almost anything, from giving humans the features and abilities of creatures, to physical enhancement, flight, and manipulation of various energies, but what had her most confused was the mechanical quirks that had occurred in the last century. She could understand, to an extent, how a technopath quirk revolving around code could work. Code was just a language after all, as far as she was aware at least, and telepathy was already a thing that existed, so combining the two together made sense. However, what sort of naturally occurring biology would give someone engines in their arms, like ingenium? Engines that ran off grape juice at that? That implied there was more going on with quirks than natural evolution, but what was it? Was there some sort of entity watching the world and playing with humans in some sort of sandbox? This also tied into her own summoning to this world. She knew how masters and servants worked, she knew about magecraft, even if she didn't actually know any herself, and she knew how it functioned. So why was a quirk mimicking a completely different system? As far as she could tell, Izuku didn't have a single magic circuit in him, and he definitely didn't have the knowledge needed to craft command seals or a summoning circle, and she definitely didn't sense any sort of grail or similar presence supporting her. By all of her knowledge, she shouldn't be able to exist in this world, yet she did. Izuku shouldn't be able to support her mana requirements, and yet he apparently did, with a seriously low energy requirement at that. A slight drop in stamina for a young and not physically active child in return for all of her deadly capabilities? Granted, she'd not gone all out, and had in fact not used her noble phantasm, what she had of one. Hers was basically just going into overdrive and unleashing every single weapon system she had on a single target, but that was still nothing to scoff at. It made her want to scream at how much sense it lacked. Even researching quirk biology didn't help. Scientists had managed to pinpoint the genetic markers that determined if one had a quirk or not, and had even made a lot of progress in matching particular ones to different types of quirks, but there was no real explanation on how that worked. There were pages and pages explaining how genetics paired up with quirks, how the quirks of the parents influenced what possibilities their child could have, excluding random mutations which existed and kinda screwed those theories over, and even links between psychology and quirks. What none of them she found could tell her was how it all worked. When calculating the energy requirements that some quirks should need, and the amount of energy a human body took in, it just didn't match up. A quick search told her that, except for particularly unusual cases, almost every human's dietary requirements were the same as they were in the pre-quirk era. That didn't go into the exact physics of them either. All Might, for example, could punch hard enough to literally change the weather. That didn't make sense, as the force necessary to disperse clouds high in the sky would easily damage structures much closer to him, yet he could unleash that sort of thing and have it simply ruffle someone's clothes when they were standing a dozen feet or so away from him. If All Might were a servant, that would make sense. Servants operated under the rules of mystery, not physics, and was one of the reasons a servant with even a moderate rank in agility could run up walls, and even across ceilings in some cases. All Might, however, was human, or assumed to be at least. That made Eli consider whether his quirk actually was super strength, as most people online seemed to believe, or whether it was some sort of energy or force amplifier that he primarily used for strength. If the latter was the case, and he amplified a force over a much larger area, then shifting clouds might be more plausible. It was still an insane level of strength however, and servant or not, Eli would not want to be hit with something like that. Actually a spirit made physical or not, it was still possible to damage her without resorting to magic, it just required an inordinate amount of power to do so. At this point, Eli was glad she wasn't organic. The level of headache she would be getting from this would be debilitating, and she wasn't finished yet. Next she wanted to do some research on animals with quirks. Nizu was the most high profile she had found, and even he was relatively unknown. She had to dig deep to find more, and she wasn't sure whether she was surprised or not that most quirked animals she found turned out to be villains. She even began to wonder if high spec was really all there was to Nizu's quirk. All animals that had quirks of their own showed heightened intelligence, a lot of them even being able to understand languages and speak them in turn. Perhaps Nizu was simply a particularly intelligent example of one? But if that was the case, what actually was his quirk? She was a servant. She didn't need sleep. She needed answers? XXXXX. The next morning, Izuku gave Eli some weird looks. She'd filled almost a full notebook with notes and she was acting jittery. That was the best word for it he had. She was acting like Izuku had that one time. His dad had been home and Izuku had gotten curious and chugged his coffee. She was also making Izuku's own head hurt with her questions. Izuku had thought he had been a quirk nerd, but he hadn't ever thought about exactly how quirks actually worked, and now he really wanted to know too. Inko had been rather bemused when Izuku almost completely abandoned his breakfast to debate the possibility of aliens being responsible for quirks, using humans for experiments or some such nonsense. This wasn't helped by Eli admitting she knew aliens actually existed, though she didn't know very much about them herself. That had sent the two off into a tangent about what she did know, and whether there was some way of proving they were responsible for quirks appearing. Inko, feeling oddly cheerful and mischievous herself, decided to play devil's advocate and tossed in some weird and wonderful theories to the mix as well. Everything from time travelers, magic and ancient curses, to extra-dimensional gods. The fact that Eli had an answer, even if in a vague way, for each of them made Inko laugh. Seeing the gleam in her son's eyes that had been missing for 4 years was worth any amount of hardship. She'd even started looking into moving just the day before. Eli was avoiding the middle of the room, staying near the walls where the floor was strongest and stepping carefully, but her weight was still putting a lot of stress on the floor. If they lived in a poorer neighborhood, where the buildings weren't built as solidly, or even worse a pre-quirk house, from before building regulations had been updated, then she'd have probably collapsed through the floor when she was going up the stairs. Even so, she was still straining the limit of what the building could handle. 4 tons was a lot of weight, more than 60 times as heavy as a normal person. Still, Eli was being careful, and she hadn't fallen through the floor yet, so while it was a concern it wasn't one that needed addressing right this second. What she did need to do was get Izuku to eat his breakfast and head out the door before he was late for school. With some well-chosen words, and a new theory thrown into their discussion for good measure, she got Izuku fed and out the door with his school bag. She drained the last of her coffee and set off herself, heading to another day of work. As she got into her car, she looked at the apartment and thought about whether she would miss it if they moved. Truthfully, not really. The people in a home were more important than any apartment would ever be. XXXXX Izuku had a rather good day at school once again. The teachers were keeping an eye out for anyone targeting him, and everyone was still confused as to why they were doing so. There'd been no announcement about him getting a quirk at last, and there wouldn't be. Now he was just another normal student. Izuku thought about having his lunch in the cafeteria today, rather than hiding away like he usually did, but decided to keep doing so. He wanted to continue talking with Eli about all the things she'd been researching through the night, and he didn't want to cause a fuss, which is what would happen if other people saw Eli. Izuku could be a rather shy person at times. Yes, he wanted to be a hero, and yes, he chased down hero sightings to see them at work, but he was also easily embarrassed and didn't yet have much self-confidence either. He'd stood up to bullies, like Kukin, but he'd become a punching bag in place of whoever they had been targeting at the time. He frowned. He'd never thought of Kukin as a bully before. Where had that come from? Was that because Eli didn't like him? She'd said, after she'd seen Kukin, that she didn't like him, and she didn't seem happy when, as he'd been jogging, he'd said he needed to do better to get anywhere near where Kukin was at. Izuku wasn't stupid, he knew Kukin did some things wrong. Hadn't he told the blonde that heroes shouldn't use their quirk to hurt people when he'd gotten in the way? Hadn't he said before that heroes shouldn't talk like that when Kukin called everyone else losers or extras? But Izuku remembered what Kukin had been like when they were 4 years old and earlier. They were absolutely best friends forever. They did everything together, went everywhere together, always played together, watched All Might videos together. They were best friends, weren't they? Kukin even had a super amazing quirk. His parents didn't really have strong combat quirks. Auntie Mitsuki had a quirk that gave her really smooth skin, and Uncle Masaru's quirk was also a sweaty one that let him rub his hands together to make little popping explosions, like cracklers. It was amazing how those two quirks combined into such a powerful one like Kukin's explosions. It even made sense to a degree. All 3 of them had sweat quirks, and glycerin was already acidic, and nitroglycerin was even more so. Okay, so Kukin's quirk wasn't exactly nitroglycerin, and Izuku theorized that Katsuki's quirk actually mixed glycerin with potassium permanganate. Either way, water diluted it down and made it a lot weaker. Izuku remembered when Kuken fell into a stream once and the explosions after were smaller and weaker when he got out, and he wasn't fully soaked at the time, just a bit wet. While he was theorizing about Katsuki's quirk, having mentally and unintentionally distracted himself from thinking about whether Katsuki was his friend or not, the school day had finished, and he took a moment to pack everything away in his bag and start heading home. Once again, however, Katsuki Bakugou got in the way. "Where is she, DEKU?" he asked, almost politely for him. "Wakachan? Where's who?" Izuku took a moment to realize he was there. "Robo-bitch, who else?" Katsuki said. "I wanna fight her." "Why?" Izuku asked, brow furrowed. "She took one of my explosions, fucking idiot." The blonde spat, as if it was obvious. "Let's see how big of one she can take before she's in pieces." Kuken, no. Izuku shook his head. "We shouldn't fight, that would be wrong." "I don't want to fight you, fucking DEKU." Katsuki laughed. "What the fuck can you even do yourself?" "I want to fight her. If I can't break a stupid robot, how will I ever be number one?" Kuken, Jews. Izuku tried to calm him down. An explosion was the response. Katsuki had had enough of his stalling. The blonde grinned widely when he saw, once again, a metal wing block his explosion and protect Izuku. Once the smoke dissipated, the form of Mecha Eli-chan was revealed once more, glaring at the boy who sought to harm her master. "So that's how it works, huh?" Katsuki's smile showed all his teeth. "She'll only appear if you're going to be hurt? That works for me." His eyes glimmered maliciously at that, before he used an explosion to launch himself at the servant. He wasn't fast enough, however, as Eli knocked him out of the air. He wouldn't let that stop him though, and used his explosions to launch himself at her again, the recoil and sudden change in direction doing nothing good for his wrists, arms, and shoulders. Seeing him coming again, Eli grabbed the aggressive child and pinned him to the ground with one foot. He struggled, but she was simply too heavy for him to shift off of himself, not that she was actually putting any weight onto his back. Most definitely a berserker, this one. Eli frowned. "One of the servant classes, mine is alter ego. Berserkers are characterized by mad enhancement, a skill which trades sanity for power. Some of them retain their intelligence, but even the best of them are crazy in some way," Eli explained. "Can you call his parents or something to come and get him?" "Oh, I have Auntie Mitsuki's number, yes," Izuku said, before pulling out his phone. After a short conversation with the exasperated woman, Izuku and Eli had a conversation about the different classes of servant, attempting to ignore the angry boy beneath the ladder's foot, who missed the entire thing in his attempts at attacking the machine keeping him pinned down. He only realized what was going on when he heard his hag of a mother's obnoxious laughter and the sound of her phone camera going off as she took a picture of his situation. He burned with both shame and rage for that. DEKU would pay for embarrassing him. Chapter 4, A Day in the Life. A 10-year-old Izuku looked out of his bedroom window and reflected on how his life had changed since Eli had been added into his life. Unfortunately, Katsuki never did give up on getting a fight out of his servant. In his eyes, Izuku was still useless, but he treated Eli like she was a completely different person to him and not the result of his quirk. Regrettably, to Katsuki there were two types of people in the world: the irrelevant extras that he derided and insulted, and obstacles that he needed to overcome, whether that be people stronger than him or villains he needed to beat up. Izuku fell into the former category and Eli fell into the latter category. However, no matter how many times he attacked Izuku to get a reaction out of Eli, he had yet to win a single fight with her. She was simply too strong and tough for him to beat, not that it wasn't getting harder to deal with him. Eli's agility was the lowest possible it was for a servant to have, and while she was no slouch, Katsuki had learned to use his explosions to rapidly change his velocity, which made him annoying to actually pin down without escalating a conflict. Yes, she could literally shoot him out of the air, fire missiles at him, use a laser, or just scream him out of the sky, but all of that was highly damaging, and while it had gotten to the point that Eli was tempted to just tear his head off and be done with it, he was a kid, and as she often had to remind herself, killing kids was wrong. Thankfully, it was now harder for Katsuki to actually track them down for a fight. Inko, after one time Eli almost did fall through the floor, actually dragged the two of them house viewing with her. Hisashi, after he heard the reason she was looking around, was in full support of it, and had even met Eli over video call a few times. She was always there when Izuku talked with his dad, so her meeting him digitally was a given. The first few properties they looked at, mostly apartments on the ground floor, were discarded for various reasons. One of them, Eli actually fell through into the cellar the moment she stepped in the house, the flooring not being up to supporting her weight at all. The last one they'd looked at, Inko had been confused why it was so cheap. The advert claimed it to be a 4-bedroom home, no upstairs, with a courtyard and an ocean view. It wasn't until they'd arrived to take a look and seen the mountains of trash that they'd remembered. Dodgeball Beach, the dumping ground of the entire prefecture, or at least it felt like it. Who would want a home that sat next to mountains of rubbish, no matter how cheap? Inko had in fact almost turned away in disgust, until Izuku had stared at the mountains with bright eyes and said he could get rid of all the trash, said it would help him exercise and be good for other people. Inko had still been dubious, until Eli said she'd get rid of the stuff nearest the house herself. The sight offended her, seeing so much metal go to waste. She'd never thought she'd feel kinship with rusted and broken microwaves before, but if she had skin it would be crawling at the sight. A bit reluctantly, but with faith in her son and his servant, Inko actually bought the property instead of renting it. With how cheap the place was going due to the piles of trash everywhere, the mortgage for it was only a bit higher than half what the rent had been for their old apartment, and the rooms were bigger too. As Eli had said she would, she cleared up all the trash near the house, taking it to the recycling center. Izuku was admittedly rather envious at the ease with which she did it, taking only a few days to do what would have taken himself weeks at least. After that, Izuku took on the challenge of cleaning the beach. He spent a few hours every day, apart from Sunday, sorting and moving the rubbish for Eli to take to the recycling plant. It had taken him almost 2 years, but he had eventually cleaned the entire beach. He joked with Eli that, if he hadn't been doing other things, he might have been able to pull it off in a year or less. Eli laughed and pushed him over, telling him that he was too shrimpy to do it in less than 18 months, minimum. It was nice that Eli had relaxed as well. She still went everywhere with Izuku, she went to school with him, she was there when he was exercising, and she even went with him when he did the shopping for him and his mother. However, when they were home, she had her own things to do, mostly centered around music. She loved to listen to it, and even dance a little if the mood took her. Exactly 1 year after Izuku had summoned her, Izuku presented her with a gift, a laptop of her own. He'd been doing odd jobs here and there secretly to save up for it, mowing lawns, washing cars, walking dogs, and similarly simple things a young boy could handle. It had taken him a while, but he was quite pleased to give her a present solely from himself. Eli had loved it. Honestly, seeing Mecha Eli-chan smiling had made it all worth it. Sneaking those jobs past Eli hadn't been easy, and she'd even known of a fair few of the jobs he'd been doing. It was impossible to hide everything, or even very much, from someone who was with him almost constantly, but she hadn't known what he'd been saving up for. Anyway, it'd gotten harder for Katsuki to start a fight with Izuku, partially because they no longer lived near each other, even if they still went to the same school, but also because Izuku took great pains to avoid him whenever possible. With Eli being able to fly, there'd been times he'd hopped out of a window and she'd carried him to the ground. She'd even checked ahead to see if Katsuki was waiting for him. With both those things, the amount of confrontations with him had gone down a lot. Katsuki, yeah, Izuku didn't call him Kaken any longer. After spending so long avoiding him because he wanted to fight Eli, he'd gotten frustrated with his former friend. It was a new way of thinking for Izuku, that he could get annoyed and fed up with the blonde. He didn't hate Katsuki. Eli had once said she didn't think he had it in him to actually hate someone, but he was definitely tired of him. He could feel the glare on him all through classes during school, and it only got worse when the last bell went. Mitsuki, if anything, was amused any time Katsuki got beaten by Eli. She actually had an entire album of Katsuki being pinned down and raging at his loss. She'd tried several times to try and rein her son in, but his head was swelled something fierce. Trying to discuss things calmly with him had him dismissing it out of hand, and being aggressive just had him return that aggression threefold back at you. Her hope now was, when he got into a hero school, that the teachers there would be able to pop his ego and bring it under control. In the time since Eli's summoning, Izuku himself had changed. He still mumbled to himself when he was thinking. He still loved heroes, and he still aspired to be one with the bright-eyed optimism that had never left him. However, now he had muscles and confidence to back it up with. Well, some confidence at least. He was still rather shy and had trouble initiating contact with others, verbal or physical, but ask about a subject he was passionate about and he would light up like a Christmas tree and almost forget he was supposed to be a shy young boy. Izuku wasn't exercising as much as he had been before. He still did some every day, mostly jogging, swimming, and a small amount of weightlifting, to maintain his fitness, but he spent his time in other ways. He got involved in community projects, and was even picking up some new languages. While Eli wasn't the original Elizabeth Bathory, she could still speak Hungarian, Greek, Latin, and German, and was quite happy to help him learn them. Inko suggested he also learn English. Yes. Since he was now 10 years old, the school would have it on the syllabus, but starting early wouldn't hurt, and he could be prepared for it then. Inko herself was enjoying life. Several of her co-workers found Izuku to be absolutely adorable when he'd volunteered at the hospital she worked at, and some of the long-time patients had even become rather familiar with him. Several even greeted him with, "My little hero," laughing a bit when he blushed and stammered a hello in response. It was amazing for Inko to see her son so happy all the time. She hadn't realized how bad things had been. Well, yes, she'd known things weren't exactly good, but looking back now, hindsight being what it was, she hadn't known just how much Izuku had been suffering. Now she truly was very happy. She and Hisashi owned their own home, right next to a now beautiful beach. Her son was happy and loved by the community, their neighbors, the hospital staff and patients, and the groups he worked with for those projects. He was learning new things that he wouldn't have before, mostly languages and martial arts. Now, if only he actually had some friends his own age. Inko had considered pulling him out of his primary school and finding somewhere different for him. Maybe if he wasn't going to the same school as Katsuki, then he might be able to actually talk to the other kids a bit. It might even help him get over his stuttering and shyness. The martial arts groups he went to, he actually attended 2 different ones, both of them once a week, did have kids his own age there, but each one was only 2 hours a week apiece. He was friendly with those there, but Inko wanted more for her son. Inko knew things were different now, but they were a much better sort of different, even if she had been a bit dubious at first about the type of people that Eli called heroes. Her son's room was still very hero-themed, but now there were pictures in there that no one would recognize, either as a hero or a villain. With Eli as a guide, and from her descriptions, Izuku had sketched out some of the heroes she remembered from before her summoning. It took him quite a bit of time, and he looked up a lot of videos online about how police sketches were done, but eventually he got good enough that Eli called it an accurate depiction of the hero she remembered. Inko had even allowed him to paint some of them on his bedroom walls, though he'd limited himself to only one of his walls. So now when he slept, he had ancient heroes of myth and legend watching over him, ranging from kings to killers. The only thing that would make it perfect would be if Hisashi was home more often. XXXXX. Good morning, Izuku. Inko greets her son as he comes in from his morning jog. And good morning to you too, Elizabeth, she adds, as the robot steps inside behind him. Again, for the 500th time, just Eli will do, the robot told her. Elizabeth sounds strange to me. Inko just smiled at her exasperation. She'd once called Eli by Elizabeth, and now teased her about it. Izuku calling her Eli had normalized the name for her, and she found being called Elizabeth weird now. Morning, Mom. Izuku smiled brightly. I'll just go take a shower and I'll be back for breakfast. Eli wandered over to Inko while Izuku disappeared off to the bathroom to get cleaned up. Not going to follow him? Inko asked. I thought you two went everywhere together. Eli gave her a deadpan look. You're cheerful today, something good happen. Kurom at work suggested a girls' day out this weekend. I decided to go along with everyone. Inko told her. We can bring a +1, girls only, and I was thinking of asking Mitsuki to come with me. She might be disappointed with Katsuki, especially in light of how he had tormented her son for years, but her and Mitsuki had been friends since they themselves were children, and their friendship survived the strain, thankfully. Inko didn't have a great many friends, and Mitsuki was her oldest by far. What, no invite for me? Eli asked, putting on a fake pout. Inko laughed and clapped Eli on the shoulder. Do you want to go to a spa? I'm pretty sure they have ones for people with mutant or transformation quirks that might work for you. Eli shuddered. No thanks, just the thought of all that steam makes me feel like I'm rusting. You can't rust, Inko countered, knowing that Eli didn't suffer from rust, metal fatigue, or other things a robot might. After all, she was more a spirit than a machine when it came down to it. Izuku still trying to summon someone new? The green-haired woman asked, turning back to finish off breakfast. Yes, but he's had no more success than when he started trying. Eli told her. He says it feels like it's ready, but it's like he hasn't worked out how to do it. It's only been 21 months since he summoned you, Inko pointed out. It was 25 between him getting his seals and summoning you. He also has a lot more stamina now, Eli countered. It's only when I use my noble phantasm and go absolutely all out that he starts getting tired. It's a lot better than how it was 2 years ago, and it's only a theory that he can summon more like you, Inko stated. This isn't your old world, the rules are much different when it comes to quirks. If what Izuku has actually is a quirk, Eli sighed. Eli-chan wasn't convinced that Izuku had a quirk at all. He lacked every indication that he had one. Quirk suppression tablets did absolutely nothing to him, and one time he had met the hero Booster Boomer and had asked him to use his quirk on Izuku. After a short explanation, the hero had been curious too, and had agreed to do it. The result was absolutely nothing happening. Of course, Izuku also wasn't a magus, or even possessed of magic circuits. Something funky was up, but she didn't know what, and she had no way of finding out. She just worried if it was a plan of some sort, but it wasn't like she could do anything about it even if she knew what was going on. At that moment, Izuku came back into the room, mildly damp from his quick shower. He sat at the table and joined the conversation while Inko finished with breakfast. What are we talking about? He asked, running fingers through his hair in a futile attempt at combing it. Just said that you failed at trying to summon someone new, Eli said. Izuku sighed. I know I've got the energy available right now, I can just feel it. Do I need a catalyst or something? You said Chaldea used a shield? The round table or something? Eli nodded. I think they said it was used as a gathering place of heroes, but there's nothing like that in this world. Before you even ask, no, hero schools don't count, they're just not special enough. Do I need to do a ritual or something? Izuku began to mutter, a notebook and pencil appearing in his hands. Formal craft is something that exists, at least in your world, but I'm not magical, but I'm mimicking something magical using my stamina in place of actual magical energy, aren't I? So, if I dash Izuku, breathe. Inko told him. You won't get anywhere like that. All you will manage to do is frustrate yourself, so take a break for now. You've come really far in the last 2 years, be proud of that at least. Izuku grumbled to himself. Not that good, I hardly ever win any fights in training. Izuku, Inko said, perhaps a bit sharply. No putting yourself down, you hear me? They've been doing it just as long as you have, and I know at least 4 of them have mutant quirks that give them a bit more strength than normal. The fact that you win any at all says plenty about yourself. Also, training isn't the same as a real fight. Eli chimed in. There's rules you have to follow, and a real fight doesn't end when you're off the mat or when someone gets so many points. It's over when one of you can't fight anymore. Besides, she shrugged. I do believe that quirks in general give everyone at least a small boost to their physical body. Not this quirk biology stuff again. Izuku sighed. You've seen heroes with elemental quirks punch through things that would break your hands. Eli chided him. The only answer there is that there's more to quirks than what's on the surface. Eli looked a little smug as Izuku just sighed in response. As she didn't need to sleep, she tended to stay awake all night long. She practically lived on the internet from 10 p.m. until 5 a.m., and she'd read a lot of stuff in that time. Admittedly, a lot of what she'd read had come from some less than reputable sources, but she'd learned quickly enough to verify everything that she could and not believe it just because it looked professionally done. She still didn't have many answers for the questions she'd first thought of 2 years ago. I'm just going to eat my breakfast and go to school. Izuku sighed. I think we're supposed to have a test today, and I kinda want to check out the shrine near the forest over the river after school too. Eli shook her head. There's nothing magical about it. Believe me, I've checked everywhere I can think of nearby for signs of magecraft, and remember, I can get around a lot faster than you can. Maybe not, but maybe I can try and summon someone there. Izuku rebutted. Besides, I can at least tidy it up. It's not like anyone takes care of shrines much these days. He was right. Religion had greatly declined following the rise of quirks. There were still religions about, and there were even cults that worshipped quirks in and of themselves, but a lot of Japan's history was slowly being lost. Major temples, especially famous ones, were still maintained, but a lot of smaller, more local ones were in various states of disrepair. Having been forgotten, or even dismissed as the old in favor of the new, had not done them any favors. Izuku may not actually believe in things like that. There'd been a time shortly after Eli had turned up when he had been swept up in the possibilities and believed wholeheartedly in religions, superstitions, myths, and legends. That had faded when Eli found absolutely nothing even remotely magical anywhere that she could reach within a 4-hour flight of their new home. Still, he found it respectful to at least tidy things up and clean the shrines themselves. There were even a few that he'd repaired and repainted. He wasn't the best at that sort of thing, but he did what he could, and that was already much more than most did. Besides, finding these shrines could sometimes be an adventure themselves, the paths there being overgrown and hidden from the main roads and pathways. Finishing his breakfast, and with a plan in mind, Izuku put his dishes by the sink, hugged his mother goodbye, grabbed his backpack, and jogged out the door on the way to school. Eli followed him, astralizing once she was past the property line. She'd almost been blamed for a crash once, a driver saying he was blinded by the sunlight reflecting off her metal body. The driver didn't actually get off with that excuse, but since then Eli tended to remain astralized when they were traveling between locations. XXXXX at school, Bakugou was waiting at the gate for him. The blonde knew that DEKU came early to school, and he couldn't get in without coming through the front gate. Well, that or being carried over the wall by his quirk it seemed, as he saw the robot dragon girl flying with Izuku in her arms, like a reverse of a bridal carry. He went to blast after them and start a fight, but Robo-bitch banked hard and swooped through the school entrance. Bakugou wasn't stupid. He knew that if he accidentally blew up something inside the school, then he would be the one paying for it. Well, his parents would pay for it, but his pocket money would stop until it reached the same amount, and he would be punished on top of that, but it was the same thing really. He was really getting pissed off with how hard it was to get a fight with the robot, and it was weirdly hard to track them down outside of school. You'd think it would be easy to find a green-haired 10-year-old and his constant robot shadow, but he tried looking and even asking around and he was sent all over the fucking place. The only two places he knew for a fact that DEKU went were some martial arts dojos in the area, and he even managed to avoid Katsuki there. All the other times he'd tried to find DEKU had lead him to a trashy beach, a few forests, nature trails, even into the foothills of a mountain once, and he'd had to catch a bus there to try and catch DEKU for a fight. Still hadn't worked. The only times he'd managed to get a fight at all were by complete chance. The little fucker was apparently part of some community group or other, and he'd taken part in things like repairing a kids' play area in a park, collecting and disposing of litter, and something to do with wild animals as well. Each time he'd seen him, he'd immediately attacked DEKU, causing the Metal Guardian to appear from fucking nowhere to defend him. Eventually, Robo-bitch would pin him down and DEKU would call his mom to come and collect him. She always brought a fucking camera now, and he had yet to find where she hid that photo album. Like fuck was he letting anyone see all that embarrassing crap? He kept one eye on DEKU all through class, and when it was time for PE, he was ready. Even better, the teacher said they were going to be doing dodgeball. Katsuki was many things, a good fucking shot being one of them. His grin got even wider as he and DEKU were put on opposite teams, and when the game started he only really had one target. He knew the robot wasn't going to appear for a dodgeball game, not even if DEKU was hit, but he would, albeit reluctantly, admit that DEKU had gotten a bit good when it came to dodging things. He wasn't Katsuki, but he was the best of the extras at least. Still a fucking useless little shit, who had to rely on someone else to save his ass, but good target practice if nothing else. Eventually, every other member of both teams were eliminated, leaving Katsuki and Izuku as the only remaining players in the game. Bakugou had the instincts necessary to not even look as he slapped away any ball Izuku tried sending his way, even ones that Izuku tried bouncing off walls, but Izuku was able to Dodge anything Katsuki sent his way. Katsuki gained a savage grin as he caught one ball from DEKU and swept up two more that were on the floor by his feet, sending one to bounce off the left wall and back at him, the second to bounce off the right wall, and the third right at him. DEKU would dodge all three, he knew, but while his opponent was focusing on those three balls, he swept up a fourth, hidden behind him, and threw it behind the straight ball. Izuku twisted out of the way of the balls coming from either side, and was about to reach out and return the straight, but as he caught it, his eyes widened at the fourth ball coming for him immediately after it. Using the ball in his hands as a sort of shield, he managed to smack the last ball away from himself. Looking back at Katsuki, he prepared to retaliate, before both of them were stopped by the teacher's whistle. "Time's up, you two," he said. "This match is a draw." Izuku nodded, before walking off the court. Katsuki looked like he wanted to snap at the teacher, but grudgingly accepted that the time was up. He huffed and slouched off the court as well, the opposite side that Izuku had left it. Some of the kids, seeing Bakugou's back turned, gave the green-haired boy a discreet thumbs up. They weren't brave enough to try and befriend someone so obviously in Bakugou's target, but it was still pretty cool that he'd managed to not lose a match to him. Izuku smiled back, ruffling his hair with one hand subconsciously, feeling a bit awkward with any sort of praise, no matter how minor. He didn't realize how this made him look even cooler to the other kids watching him. He kept a smile on his face throughout the rest of the lesson, and even the rest of the school day. As usual, Bakugou was waiting at the school gate for him, and as was becoming a habit he hopped out of a window to be carried by a flying mecha Eli-chan to the ground. A teacher actually walked by the window when this was happening, but they didn't even look surprised. Honestly, none of them really blamed him for taking the easy way out. XXXXX When they reached the shrine Izuku had meant to visit, he pulled out a notebook and began to note down everything that needed doing. As was usual, the paint was faded and the wood wasn't in the best condition, the path was overgrown, and it needed to be swept at the very least. He'd come back tomorrow with what he needed to fix it up, but while he was here he might as well give summoning another try. Sitting on the ground before the shrine, enough room in front of him for a person to stand and not tread all over him, he took a deep breath. He tried to feel for the command seals on his hand, tried to pull on his stamina, and tried to think about who he might summon. Would he get a Japanese servant? Tamamo no Me? Ashiwa Kamaru? Would he get someone who Mecha Eli-chan had known herself before he summoned her? Would he get a hero? A villain? Someone true and righteous? Someone misunderstood or unfortunate? Would he get someone who knew what they did was wrong yet did it anyway? He could feel it, he really could, and he knew it wasn't his imagination. He could summon someone else, he knew he could. This wasn't where he would stagnate, this wasn't his limit, and whoever he summoned would help him become more than he already was, would help make him the hero he knew he could be. "Please, if you can hear me, then please come to me." Izuku spoke aloud. It wasn't any sort of prayer or incantation, just a heartfelt plea and invitation. "I know I'm not that good, I know. There's not much I can offer you," he continued. "I want to be a hero, and I need all the help I can get. It's going to be hard, I know it, and I'm prepared, but please, if you can hear me, then help me be the best hero that I can be." It worked. He knew it worked before he even looked. There wasn't anything that made him think it worked, just an absolute certainty that it had worked. He had scrunched his eyes tightly closed as he had entreated anyone that could hear him, and when he opened them, he saw her, his new servant. Chapter 3, Questions and No Answers. When they arrived home,